Today, we're diving into the incredible cultural earthquake that shook Brazil when it finally broke free from 2 decades of military dictatorship. We're going to trace this amazing journey from a nation silenced by censorship to one just exploding with new voices, new music, and, yeah, new conflicts, all while trying to figure out what it even meant to be Brazilian in a brand new and pretty uncertain democratic world. This one lyric from the iconic 80s rock band Legião Urbana just nails the feeling of the time. It's this perfect snapshot of a country that was completely cynical about its institutions, but at the same time was hanging on to this stubborn, almost contradictory hope for a better future. That was the heartbeat of a whole generation that was just starting to find its voice. So that powerful belief in the future, that was the engine for all the change. But it also set the country up for some serious disappointment down the road. And that's really the big question we're going to dig into. What happens to a culture when the dream that was holding everything together starts to fall apart? To really get the culture that came next, we have to start with the morning after the party. See, for years, the military regime had been selling the story of an economic miracle, a future where Brazil was going to be this global superpower. But by the early 80s, that party was definitely over. And the whole country woke up with a massive civic hangover. Yeah, that dream of Brazil as a global titan, it was dead. And what was left was this really harsh reality. All the problems the regime had promised to fix, inequality, corruption, crazy inflation, they were actually worse than ever. This wasn't just some economic downturn. It was a deep, deep crisis of national identity. The promise that had been used to justify 20 years of authoritarian rule was completely and totally broken. And get this quote from the last military president. It just perfectly sums up the tension of the whole era. Officially, the regime was talking about a slow, gradual, and safe return to democracy. But in reality, the language they used was still rooted in threats. It was this fundamental contradiction, a promise of freedom that always came with the shadow of repression hanging over it. So in this kind of environment, the media world basically split in two. On one hand, you had the official, super sanitized version of Brazil. And then on the other, you had the lively, critical, and often hilarious world of the underground press. To understand media in Brazil at this time, you have to know one name: Globo. The TV network was so dominant, so powerful, that an ad executive actually coined the term TV Globês, which literally means Globo speak. Through its nightly news and its super popular soap operas, the novellas, Globo basically created a standardized national culture. It shaped how people talked, what they cared about, what they thought it meant to be Brazilian. It was a huge tool for unifying a massive country, for sure, but it was also an engine for cultural conformity, and it was often very closely aligned with what the government wanted people to hear. So you end up with this really stark divide in the media. On one side, there's Globo, this national behemoth pushing a standardized official vision of Brazil. And on the other side, you've got the alternative press. These were small, scrappy newspapers and magazines. They couldn't even dream of competing on reach, but they carved out their space by offering everything Globo didn't: sharp satire, fearless criticism, and a worldview that was completely opposed to the regime. It was a real David versus Goliath story playing out on newsstands. So how in the world did this alternative press manage to survive? Well, they used what you could call the weapons of the weak. Direct criticism was a big no-no because of censorship, so humor became their #1 strategy. They got incredibly good at using irony and metaphor, creating these wild characters and comic strips that could say what couldn't be said outright. A cartoon couldn't directly call a general corrupt, but it could definitely draw a pig in a military hat counting a pile of money. Publications like the legendary Opa Scheme used this kind of shared secret language to build a really powerful sense of community among its readers. It was like a network of people who were all in on the same joke. But you can only heat that kind of energy underground for so long. As the regime started to weaken, the dam began to crack. And by the mid-80s, culture and politics just flooded into the public square, and they merged into this unstoppable force for change. And at the absolute heart of all of this was the Diretas Já movement. The demand was so simple but so powerful: give people the right to vote for their own president. It just became this massive rallying cry for absolutely everyone who wanted the dictatorship to end: politicians, artists, regular citizens, you name it. The way the whole thing caught fire was incredible. It started off kind of formally, with politicians debating a constitutional amendment. But then it just exploded into this mass movement. You had these enormous rallies, packed with music and speeches, taking over the main squares of Brazil's biggest cities. We're talking millions of people out on the streets. Now here's the crazy part. The amendment actually failed in Congress. But in the end, it didn't even matter. The movement had shown the regime that its time was up. The people had found their voice, and there was no going back. A return to civilian rule was now inevitable. And there was another really crucial piece of this puzzle, and it came from a place you might not expect, the Catholic Church. A powerful movement called liberation theology basically reframed faith as a tool for social justice. And this wasn't about top-down charity, it was about bottom-up empowerment. Priests and organizers would go into poor neighborhoods and rural communities, forming what they called ecclesial-based communities. These groups didn't just study the Bible. They organized for land rates, for better wages, for basic services. They taught people that they could be the agents of their own change. All right, so as Brazil's whole political landscape is getting a massive makeover, so is its soundtrack. The music from the 80s and 90s is like this perfect map of the country's changing hopes, fears, and identities. And man, did the country's soundtrack evolve quickly. In the early 80s, when everyone was feeling pretty disillusioned, rock became the main voice of protest. Then, as democracy officially came back in the late 80s, you get this more optimistic, more commercial sound taking over the radio, with pop genres like Oxê and the country-style sertanejo all over TV. But that commercial happiness didn't last. By the early 90s, a whole new wave of really powerful countercultural critique bubbled up from the cities, powered by the raw energy of rap and the totally revolutionary fusion of Mangue Beat. So what was this 80s rock all about? Well, this was not the optimistic revolutionary protest music from the 1960s. No way. This generation had lost its faith in all those big ideas. Their lyrics were super skeptical of traditional politics. Instead, they focused on just calling out the raw social inequality they were seeing every single day. The songs were often way more personal and intimate, kind of channeling this individual angst that really reflected the whole country's uncertainty. They didn't have high hopes for the future, and they were not afraid to scream about it. And then, in the early 90s, something completely new and different just exploded out of the city of Recife in the northeast. It was called Mangue Beat. And this wasn't just a style of music, it was a whole cultural movement. The sound they created was just this electrifying mix of stuff you'd never heard together before. Just imagine the deep, ancient drumming of maracatu, this traditional rhythm from the Northeast, and then fuse it with distorted rock guitars, urgent rap vocals, and modern electronic beats. Bands like the legendary Chico Science and Asan Zumbi used this incredible sound to paint a picture of their reality. They sang about the urban decay in their city, the struggle to keep a local identity in a globalizing world, and the fact that social inequality was still a massive problem. It was fiercely local and radically global, all at the same time. So this brings us to the 1990s. A newly democratic Brazil now has to figure out its place, not just at home, but in a world that's globalizing at lightning speed. And of course, big economic changes and new technologies were about to reshape everything all over again. You have to remember, for years, Brazil was dealing with this crippling hyperinflation. But in 1994, a new economic plan called the Plano Real finally got the currency stable. And for the first time, a lot of working-class Brazilians actually had predictable money in their pockets. This had a huge cultural impact. People could suddenly afford to buy CDs, to go to the movies, and to take part in this mass consumer culture that had always been out of their reach before. And you can see this whole journey reflected perfectly in the evolution of television, which, let's face it, was the country's main cultural engine. It started out in the 50s as something just for the elite. Then it became this populist tool for national unity under the military regime. The late 70s and 80s were all about huge tech developments and international expansion, which really cemented Globo's power. But the 90s brought the biggest change of all, globalization and the arrival of pay TV. For the first time, the audience started to break into different groups, and this wave of international shows and movies came flooding in. The era of TV Globais as the single unifying national language was finally facing some real competition. Which really leaves us with this one big final thought. That journey, from the coded messages of the underground press to the explosion of Diretas Já, was a long, hard fight for the right to speak freely. But as the 20th century came to a close, Brazil faced a totally new kind of challenge. In a world with open markets, cable TV, and the internet, what stories was it going to tell? What unique voice was it going to project out to the world? That's the question this new democracy was going to have to answer.